Krabat by Otfried Preussler. The Second Year. Chapter 1. The Custom of the Guild. The master stayed away for the next few days, and during that time the mill stood still. The miller's men lay on their beds or sat by the warm stove. They ate little and did not say much. They took particular care not to mention Tonda's death, just as if there never had been a head journeyman called Tonda at the mill in the fen of Kosel. Tonda's clothes lay at the end of his bed, neatly folded and piled up, his breeches, shirt, and smock, his belt, his apron, and his cap on the top. Juro brought them up on the evening of New Year's Day, and all the men tried to act as if they didn't see the clothes there at all. Krabat was very downcast. He felt lost and miserable. Tonda's death could not have been an accident, and the longer he thought about it, the more certain of that he became. There must be something odd going on here, though he knew nothing about it. Something that his companions were keeping from him. What was the secret? Why had Tonda never told him? Questions kept coming into the boy's mind. If only he had something to do. Idling his time away made him feel quite unwell. These days, Juro was the only busy one among them. He kept the stove alight, did the cooking, and saw that meals were served on time, although the others left most of the food on their plates. It must have been the morning of the fourth day when he stopped to speak to Krabat in the hall of the house. "Like to do something for me, Krabat? You might cut me up some firewood for kindling." "All right," said Krabat, following him into the kitchen. There was a faggot of pine wood lying by the hearth, waiting to be cut up small. Juro went to get a knife, but Krabat said he had his own knife with him. "Even better. Go ahead then, and mind you don't cut yourself." Krabat set to work, and it felt as though some strange power were coming from Tonda's knife. Thoughtfully, he weighed it in his hand. For the first time since the new year, he took heart again and felt new confidence welling up within him. Juro had come up beside him, unnoticed, and was looking over his shoulder. "That's a good knife you have there," said he. "It's a keepsake," said the boy. "A present from a girl, eh?" "No, from a friend," said Krabat. "I'll never have another friend like him again." "How can you be so sure?" asked Juro. "I'm as sure of that as ever I can be of anything," Krabat replied. The morning after they buried Tonda, the miller's men agreed to make Hanzo head journeyman, and Hanzo gave his consent. The master stayed away until the eve of 12th night. They were already in bed, and Krabat was about to blow out the light when the attic door opened and the master appeared on the threshold, very pale, white as a sheet. He cast a glance around the room, seeming to overlook Tonda's absence. At least, he gave no sign of noticing it. To work, he ordered them. Then he turned around and was seen no more for the rest of the night. The miller's men sprang to life, throwing back the covers, jumping out of bed, and flinging on their clothes. "Hurry up, or the master will be angry," Hanzo urged them. "You know what he is." Petar and Stashko ran to the mill pond to open the sluice. The others stumbled down to the grinding room, poured grain into the hopper, and set the mill going. As it began to work, with a creaking and a clanking and a hollow thudding, the men felt light at heart. "The mill is grinding again," thought Krabat, "and life goes on." They finished work at midnight. When they came back to the attic, they saw someone lying on Tonda's bed, a pale, thin little fellow, with narrow shoulders and a mop of red hair. They surrounded the sleeping lad and woke him, just as Krabat had been woken a year ago. And just like Krabat, a year ago, the red-headed boy was frightened to see 11 ghostly figures standing by his bed. "Don't be afraid," said Michael. "We are the miller's men here. You needn't be frightened of us." "What's your name?" "Vitko. What's yours?" I'm Michael, and this is Hanzo, the head journeyman. This is my cousin Merton. This is Juro. When Vidko came down to breakfast next morning, he was wearing Tonda's clothes. They fitted as if they had been made for him. He did not seem to be puzzled by that, nor did he ask whose they were before. Krabat thought it was better that way. It made things easier for him to bear. That evening, the new apprentice had been hard at work in the meal store all day, and had gone to bed. That evening, the master summoned Krabat and the other men to his room. He sat in his armchair, wearing a black cloak, with 2 candles burning on the table before him, and a hatchet lying between them. His black 3-cornered hat was on the table too. I have summoned you here as the rules of the mill and the customs of the guild lay down, said he, when they were all assembled. If there is an apprentice among you, let him come forward. It was a moment before Krabat realized that the master meant him. When Peter nudged him in the ribs, he pulled himself together and stepped forward. Your name? My name is Krabat. Who will vouch for it? I will, said Hanzo, stepping forward beside Krabat. I will vouch for this boy and his name. One is no better than none, replied the master. Michael spoke up, standing on the other side of Krabat. No, but 2 are a pair, and a pair is surety enough. I will vouch for this boy and his name too. The dialogue that now went on between the master and the 2 journeymen was a series of questions and answers, all in set words. The master asked the 2 men whether, where, and when the apprentice Krabat had learned the miller's craft, and they assured him that the boy had been properly trained for his trade. Do you vouch for that to me? We do, replied Hanzo and Michael. Very well. Then we will release this apprentice, Krabat, from his indentures, according to the rules of the mill and the custom of the guild. Released from his indentures. Krabat could not believe his ears. Was his apprenticeship really up after only 1 year? Standing up, the master put on his 3-cornered hat. Then he took the hatchet in his hand and went up to the boy, touching the crown of Krabat's head and then his shoulders. With the blade of the hatchet, he said solemnly, In the name of the guild, Krabat, I, your teacher and master, do hereby release you from your former articles of apprenticeship in the presence of all my journeymen. In future, you will be one of them and will be maintained as a journeyman according to the customs of the guild. So saying, he gave Krabat the hatchet. It was the privilege of a free journeyman miller to carry a hatchet at his belt. Then he dismissed them all. Krabat was surprised and bewildered. All this was completely unexpected. He was the last to leave the room, closing the door behind him. All of a sudden, a flour sack was flung over his head. Someone seized him by the shoulders and someone else by the legs. Off with him to the grinding room. That was Andrush's voice. Krabat struggled to free himself, in vain. Laughing and shouting, the others hauled him off to the grinding room and flung him on top of a meal bin. Then they began to work him over. He's done with his apprenticeship, cried Andrush. Now let's put him through the mill, brothers. A journeyman miller must be ground fine. They pummeled Krabat like a lump of dough. They rolled him back and forth on the meal bin until he felt quite dizzy. They cuffed and thumped him. And someone hit him quite hard on the head a couple of times, until Hanzo intervened. That'll do, Lishko, said he. We may put a new journeyman through the mill, but we don't want to kill him. When they left off, Krabat felt as if he really had been through a mill. Peter removed the sack, and Stashko scattered a handful of flour on his head. Krabat has now duly been through the mill, Andrush announced. Thank you, brothers. He's a real journeyman miller now, worthy to be one of us. Good for Krabat. cried Petar and Stashko, who were the ringleaders along with Andrush. Up with Krabat. Once again, Krabat was seized by his arms and legs, and the miller's men threw him up in the air and caught him. They tossed him 3 times, and then sent Juro down to the cellar for wine to celebrate. Krabat had to drink to each of them in turn. Here's to you, brother. Your health, brother. While the others went on drinking, Krabat sat down on a heap of empty sacks. It was not surprising that his head was throbbing after all he had been through that evening. Later, Michael sat down beside him. You seem rather puzzled about certain things. Yes, I am, said Krabat. How could the master release me from my apprenticeship? It can't be over already. Ah, your first year in this mill is equal to 3 in the world outside, said Michael. Haven't you noticed how much older you've grown since you first arrived, Krabat? You're exactly 3 years older now. But that's not possible. Yes, it is possible, said Michael. And other things are possible in this mill too, as you ought to have realized by now. Chapter 2. A Mild Winter. The winter went on as it had begun, snowy and mild. This year, the men did not have much trouble with ice outside the sluice, at the weir, and on the mill race. They could break it up quite quickly, and sometimes it would not freeze again for several days. Instead, there were frequent and heavy snowstorms, much to the annoyance of the new apprentice, who could barely keep pace with his job of clearing away the snow. Looking at young Vitko, who was so skinny and always had a drip on the end of his nose, Krabat realized that Michael must be right when he said he himself had grown 3 years older, as he really ought to have noticed long before, from the changes in his voice and body, his increased strength, and the way hair was sprouting on his cheeks. It looked no more than soft down, but if he stroked it, he could feel it distinctly. During these weeks, he kept thinking of Tonda. He missed him all the time, and he was sorry he could not visit his grave. He had tried twice, and he did not get far either time. There was too much snow out in the fen, and he stuck in it before he could go far. But he was still determined to make a 3rd attempt, the next time he had the chance. Then he had a dream. It is spring. The snow has melted in the sun and the wind. Krabat is walking through the fen of Kossel. It is night. It is day. The moon is in the sky. The sun is shining. Soon, Krabat will reach the waste ground. He sees a figure coming toward him through the mist. No, it is going away. He believes it is Tonda. Tonda. He cries, "Stop! It's me, Krabat." It seems to him that the figure hesitates for a moment. Then, as he walks on, the figure, too, moves away. Tonda. Krabat begins to run. He runs as fast as he can go. The space between them narrows. "Tonda," he calls. Now he is only a few paces away, and he finds a ditch at his feet. The ditch is wide and deep. There is no bridge over it, no plank to help him cross. Tonda is on the other side. He turns his back to Krabat. "Why are you running away from me, Tonda?" "I am not running away from you. I am on the other side, as you can see. Stay on your side. At least turn your face to me. I cannot look back, Krabat. I am not allowed to, but I can hear you, and I'll answer you. I will answer you 3 times in all. Now ask me your questions." "What questions?" Krabat does not need to think twice. "Tonda, who brought you to your death?" "I myself, for the most part." "And who else?" "That you will learn, Krabat, if you keep your eyes open." Now for the last question. Krabat wonders, There is so much he would like to know. I'm very lonely, he says. Since you went, I have no friend. Whom can I trust? What do you advise me? Even now, Tonda does not look at him. Go home, says he. You can trust the very first man who calls you by your name. You may safely rely on him. And one more thing, one last word, before I go. It doesn't matter whether you visit my grave or not. I know you are thinking of me, and that is what matters. Slowly, Tonda raises his hand in farewell. Then he dissolves into the mist and vanishes, without once turning his head. Tonda! Krabat calls after him. Don't go, Tonda. Don't leave me. He shouts as loud as he can, and suddenly he hears someone call, Krabat! Wake up, Krabat! Wake up! Michael and Juro were standing by Krabat's bed, bending over him. Krabat did not know if he was awake or still dreaming. Who called me? He asked. We did, said Juro. You'd have just heard yourself shouting in your sleep. Did I? Asked Krabat. It was heart-rending. It really was. Michael took his hand. Do you have a fever? No, said Krabat. I was just dreaming. Which of you called my name first? He added urgently. Tell me. I must know. But Michael and Juro couldn't tell. They said they hadn't noticed. Another time we'll count each other out for the privilege of waking you, said Juro. Just to make sure there's no doubt about it later. Krabat felt sure it must have been Michael who called his name first. Juro was a nice fellow, of course. Good-natured through and through, but he was such a fool. Tonda must have meant Michael when he and Krabat talked in Krabat's dream. After this, Krabat turned to Michael when he wanted someone to advise him or answer a question. Michael did not fail him. He was always willing to tell Krabat what he wanted to know. Only once, when Krabat broached the subject of Tonda, did Michael put him off. The dead are dead, said Michael, and talking won't bring them back to life. In many ways, Michael was like Tonda. Krabat guessed that he was secretly helping the new apprentice. For now and then, he would see him standing talking to Vitko, just as Tonda used to stop and talk to Krabat at times last winter, when he helped him by magic. Juro, too, took the new apprentice under his wing in his own way, constantly urging him to eat. Eat up, my boy, he would say. Eat all you can. It'll make you grow tall and strong and put some flesh on those bones of yours. The week after Candlemas, they went to work in the woods. 6 men, Krabat among them, were to bring home the tree trunks they had felled and stacked up last year. This was no easy task in the deep snow. It took them a whole week to clear a way to the place where the trees were stored, even though Michael and Merton, who did valiant work, were in the party. Andrush could not understand the cousin's enthusiasm. He did only as much work as was necessary to keep him warm. If you work so slowly you freeze, you're an ass, said he. And if you work so hard you sweat, why, you're worse than an ass. You're a mooncalf. It was so warm at noon, those fine February days, that the snow melted enough for the men to get their feet wet out in the woods. And when they came home at night, they had to grease their boots well with tallow, working it in with the ball of the thumb to keep the leather supple. Otherwise, it would have become rock-hard overnight when the boots hung over the stove to dry. Each man did this tiresome job for himself, except for Lishko, who got hold of Vitko and made him do it. When Michael noticed this, he took Lishko to task for it, in front of everyone. Lishko merely shrugged it off. Well, what of it? He said in an offhand way. My boots are wet, and what are apprentice boys for, if not to work? Not for you, said Michael. Well, it's none of your business to meddle. You're not head journeyman here, are you? "No, I'm not," Michael admitted. "But I doubt if Hanzo will mind if I tell you to grease your own boots in the future, Lishko. Or you might get into trouble. And no one can say I didn't warn you." Soon after this, someone did get into trouble, and it was not Lishko. Next Friday evening, when the men were perched in the black room in the shape of ravens, the master said it had come to his ears that one of them was secretly helping the new apprentice, making his work easier, which was forbidden. Such conduct deserved punishment, and so saying, he turned to Michael. "Why are you helping that boy? Answer me." "I feel sorry for him, master. The work you expect him to do is too hard for him." "So that's what you think, eh?" "Yes," said Michael. "You listen to me then." The miller had risen to his feet and was leaning over the table, resting his hands on the book of necromancy. "What I expect or do not expect of anyone is no concern of yours. Have you forgotten that I am the master? What I do, and there's an end of it. Now I am going to give you a lesson you will remember all your life. Out, the rest of you." He sent the other journeymen out of the room and shut himself in with Michael. The others went off to bed, heavy at heart. For half the night they heard dreadful sounds of screeching and cawing echoing through the house. At last, Michael came staggering up the attic stairs, pale and haggard. "What did he do to you?" asked Merton. Michael made a weary gesture. "Leave me alone, will you?" he said. The others had a very good idea who had betrayed Michael to the master, and next day they held a conference in the meal store and decided to get even with Lishko. "We'll get him out of bed tonight, and then his hide," said Andrush. "With a good stout stick apiece," cried Merton. "And then we'll shave his head and smear his face with tallow," growled Hanzo, "and top it all off with soot." Michael was sitting in a corner saying nothing. "Speak up, do," cried Stashko. "After all, it was you he told tales of." "Very well," said Michael. "I'll tell you what I think." He waited until they were silent, and then began to speak in a quiet voice, much as Tonda would have spoken in his place. "Lishko played me a shabby trick," said he, "but what you're thinking of doing is not much better. Well, no one weighs every word he says in anger, but now it's off your chests. Let that be the end of it. I don't want to feel ashamed of the way you act." Chapter 3. Long Live Augustus. The miller's men did not give Lishko a thrashing. Instead, they left him severely alone. No one spoke to him. No one answered when he asked a question. Juro gave him his oatmeal and his soup in a separate bowl. "You can't expect anyone to share the same dish as a rat," he said. Krabat agreed. Anyone who told tales on his comrades to the master deserved to be ostracized. At the next new moon, when the goodman drove up with his sacks to be ground, the miller had to lend a hand again. He worked very hard, as if to show his men what work really meant. Or was it more to impress the goodman? The master was away a good deal in the latter part of the winter, sometimes going on horseback, sometimes taking the sleigh. The men did not know what kind of business he was about, and they did not trouble their heads about it. They had no need to know what didn't concern them, and what they didn't know would do them no harm. One evening, near St. Joseph's Day, when the snow had melted, and it was raining hard, so that the miller's men thought themselves lucky to be sitting in the dry in such vile weather, the master suddenly ordered his traveling carriage, saying he had to go out on important business, and it was urgent. Krabat helped Peta put the 2 bay horses into the shafts, and then held the near horse by the bridle, and soothed him. While Peter ran back into the house to tell the master the carriage was ready, Krabat led the team out to the front yard of the mill. He had flung a horse blanket over his head to keep the rain off, and he put a couple of rugs out for the master, too, in case they were wanted. The carriage was a light one, open at the front. The master came striding out, followed by Pitar with a storm lantern. He was wearing a voluminous cloak and his black three-cornered hat. Spurs clinked on his boots, and a dagger stuck out under his cloak. "This is crazy," thought Krabat, as the master settled himself on the box. "Does he have to go out in weather like this?" The master, who had wrapped himself in the rugs, asked Krabat casually, "Would you like to come?" "Me? You wanted to know why I was going out, didn't you?" Krabat's curiosity was stronger than his disinclination to get wet. He was up on the box beside the miller in a twinkling. "Now let's see if you can drive." So saying, the miller handed him the reins and whip. "We must be in Dresden within the hour." Dresden, in an hour. Krabat could not believe his ears. "Off we go. Drive on," cried the miller. They rattled down the bumpy path through the wood. It was pitch dark, like driving through a stovepipe. "Faster," the master urged him. "Can't you drive faster?" "I'll upset the carriage if I do, master." "Nonsense. Hand me the reins." And the master drove on himself. How he drove! Out of the wood he went like the wind, and on to the high road to Kamenz. Clinging to his seat, Krabat had to brace his feet against the footboard. The rain whipped his face, and the wind they made almost swept him out of the carriage. It had turned misty, and they were racing into the mist. It wrapped itself around them, but before long their heads rose above it, and it sank lower and lower, until it lingered only around the horses' fetlocks. It had stopped raining, and the moon was shining, but the ground was still veiled in mist, a broad expanse of silvery white, like snow. Were they going across country? Krabat could hear no sound of hooves or clatter of wheels. The jolting and rattling of the carriage had stopped some time ago. He felt as if they were driving over a carpet, or soft snow, or down. The horses stepped out with a smooth, springing stride. It was a joy to drive over the rolling moor in the moonlight like this. Suddenly there was a jolt that made every joint in the carriage creak. Had they run into a tree stump? A curbstone? What would they do if the shaft was broken, or one of the wheels? "I'll just get out and look." Krabat already had a foot on the running board when the master seized hold of him and pulled him back. "Stay where you are." He pointed down. The mists had parted. Krabat could hardly believe his eyes. Down below him lay the ridge of a roof, and below that, a graveyard. Crosses and grave mounds cast their shadows in the moonlight. "We're stuck on the Kamenz church tower," said the master. "Mind you don't fall out of the carriage." He tugged at the reins and cracked his whip. "Gee, up there." Another jolt, and the carriage was afloat in the air again. They went on their way without any more incidents, driving fast and silently through the air, over white clouds gleaming in the moonlight. "And I took them for mist," thought Krabat. The clock of the royal chapel was striking 9:30 when Krabat and the master reached Dresden. With a creak, the carriage settled on the paved forecourt of the castle. A groom came running up and took the reins. "Same as usual, sir?" What a stupid question. The master threw the man a coin, and then jumped down from the carriage, telling Krabat to follow him into the castle. They hurried up the steps leading to the gate. At the top, an officer barred their way. He was tall as a tree, wearing a broad silk sash, and the moonlight shone on his breastplate. "Give the password." Instead of answering, the master pushed him aside. The officer put his hand to his dagger to draw it, but he could not. With a snap of his fingers, the master had rooted him to the spot. And there the tall man stood, stiff as a poker, his eyes opened wide, his hand on the hilt of his dagger. "Come along," said the master. That fellow must be new here. Inside the gateway, they hurried up a flight of marble stairs, and then through halls and passageways, past walls lined with mirrors and windows with heavy, gold-patterned hangings. The doorkeepers and lackeys they met all seemed to know the master, for no one barred their way or stopped to question them. They all stood silently aside, bowed, and let the master and Krabat pass. Ever since they had entered the castle, Krabat had felt he was dreaming. He was overwhelmed by so much magnificence, by all the brilliance and grandeur around him, and he felt he must look terribly shabby in his miller's smock. Are the lackeys all laughing at me? He wondered. Are the doorkeepers turning up their noses behind my back? He felt something trip him, and he stumbled. What was this? Why, there was a sword between his feet, tripping him. Whose sword, for goodness sake? A glance in the nearest mirror stopped him in his tracks. He couldn't understand it. He was wearing a black military tunic with silver buttons, tall leather boots, and a sword belt with a rapier in it. Was that a three-cornered hat on his head? Since when did he wear a white, powdered bag wig? He opened his mouth to cry, "Master, what's all this? What does it mean?" But he never uttered the words, for just then they came into a candle-lit anteroom where several gentlemen were standing, army captains and colonels and courtiers with the stars and ribbons of their orders on their breasts. A chamberlain approached the master. "Thank heaven you're here at last," he said. "The elector is waiting for you. You are not alone," he added, pointing to Krabat. "My squire," said the master. "He can wait here." The chamberlain beckoned to one of the captains. "Will you look after the gentleman's squire, sir?" Taking Krabat's arm, the captain guided him to a small table in one of the alcoves by the windows. "Will you take wine or chocolate, my dear sir?" Krabat decided on a glass of red wine, and as the captain and he drank each other's health, the master entered the elector's own state apartments. "Let's hope he succeeds," said the captain. "Succeeds in what?" asked Krabat. "Why, surely you must know. You're his squire. Hasn't your master been trying to convince the elector for weeks that his highness's counselors, who want us to make peace with Sweden, are nothing but fools, and he ought to send them packing?" "Yes, of course," said Krabat hastily, although he had no notion of any of this. The captains and colonels standing by laughed and drank a toast. "To the war with Sweden," they cried. "And may the elector decide to go on with it. Victory or defeat, but the war with Sweden must go on." It was nearly midnight when the master came back, conducted to the threshold of the anteroom by the elector himself. "We thank you," said the elector. "Your counsel is most valuable to us, as you well know, and though it has taken us some time to open our mind to all your reasons and arguments, the decision is now made. The war goes on." The gentlemen in the anteroom rattled their swords and waved their hats in the air. "Long live Augustus," they cried. "Glory to his highness, the elector, and death to the Swedes." The elector of Saxony, a heavy, fleshy man of gigantic build, with the muscles of a blacksmith and fists worthy of any bargeman, thanked his courtiers with a wave of his hand. Then, turning to the master, he said something to him that no one else caught, what with all the noise in the room, and which probably was not meant for other ears, and with that, he dismissed him. While the courtiers and the army officers stayed behind in the anteroom, Krabat followed the master out. They left the castle the same way as they had come, past the great windows and the mirror-lined walls, through halls and passageways, down the marble stairs to the gateway, and out onto the steps, where the tall officer still stood, stiff as a poker, eyes opened wide, his hand on the hilt of his dagger. "Free him, Krabat," said the master. Krabat had only to snap his fingers in a way he had learned in the black school. "Off with you," he ordered. "Right about, turn." The officer drew his dagger and saluted with the naked blade. Then he turned right, as Krabat had ordered, and marched away. The carriage was waiting for them on the forecourt of the castle, and the groom assured the master that he had carried out his orders and seen to the bay horses. "So I should hope," said the master. And then they climbed up on the box. Only now did Krabat realize he was back in his old clothes again. Well, of course. What would he do with a three-cornered hat, a rapier, and a smart military tunic at the mill? They rattled across the stone bridge over the river Elbe, and once they were out of the city of Dresden and had reached the heights on the other side of the river, the master drove the carriage off the road. The horses rose from the ground again, and home they drove through the air. The moon was in the west, very low already, and it would soon go down. Krabat was silent, lost in thought. He looked down at the villages and little towns as they passed over them in their flight. The fields and woods, ponds and streams, the moorland with its bogs and shallow sandy hollow, and all the peaceful countryside lying dark and quiet below them. "What are you thinking of?" asked the master. "I'm thinking of all a man can do with a knowledge of the black art," said Krabat. "Why? The black art gives you power even over kings and princes." Chapter 4. An Easter Candle. Easter was late that year, falling in the second half of April. The evening before Good Friday, Vitko was received into the black school. Krabat had never seen such a skinny, untidy raven as Vitko made. He thought he could spot a reddish gleam on Vitko's feathers, too, but perhaps that was his imagination. The miller's men spent Saturday sleeping, and late in the afternoon Juro gave them an enormous meal. "Eat as much as you can," Hanzo advised them. "You know it will have to last some time." For the first time, they let Lishko share the same dish with them. The rule said that at Eastertide, all quarrels among the miller's men must be forgotten. As dark fell, the master sent out his men to bring back the sign. Everything happened exactly as it had the year before. Once again, the master counted out his men. Once again, they left the mill in pairs. This time, Krabat's partner was Juro. "Where do we go?" "To Bommel's End, if it's all the same to you." "Very well," said Juro. "So long as you know the way. I'm no use at night. I'd be lucky to find my way from the house to the stable without getting lost." "I'll go ahead then," said Krabat. "Mind you don't lose track of me in the dark." Krabat had only once before trodden the path they were now taking, and that was with Tonda. It was not difficult to cross the fen, but it might be harder once they came out on the other side of the wood and had to find the path leading over the fields and past Schwarzkolm village. "If worst comes to worst, we'll have to cut across country," thought Krabat. But all went well. In spite of the darkness, they found the path quite easily and went over the fields with the lights of the village to their left. After a while, they reached the road on the other side of Schwarzkolm and followed it to the next turning. "It ought to be somewhere here," said Krabat. They groped their way along the side of the road from pine to pine. Krabat was glad when at last his fingers met the squared upright of the wooden cross. "This way, Juro." Juro came stumbling up. "However did you find it, Krabat?" "I'd like to see anyone else do that." He dug into his pockets, produced flint and steel, and they lit a handful of twigs. By the light of their small fire, they gathered pieces of bark and dead branches that were lying under the trees. "I'll tend the fire," said Juro. "Fires and firewood now. That's something I can deal with." Krabat wrapped himself in his blanket and sat down under the cross, just as Tonda had sat there a year ago. Upright, his knees drawn up, his back against the wood of the cross. Juro told stories to pass the time, and every now and then Krabat said, "Yes, oh well, or imagine that." He spoke at random, not really listening, but it was enough to keep Juro happy. Juro talked on, telling stories about anything that happened to occur to him, and it did not seem to bother him that Krabat was hardly attending. Krabat was thinking of Tonda, and at the same time he was thinking of the girl from Schwarzkopf, the girl who led the choir. She had come into his mind unbidden. He was glad to think that soon he would hear her sing again as her voice floated over from the village at midnight. But suppose he didn't hear her? Suppose some other girl was singing the solo part this year? When he tried to remember her voice, he made the discovery that he could no longer do so. It was quite vanished from his mind, gone, obliterated. Or did he only think so? It gave him pain to think he had forgotten her voice, and the pain he felt was of a kind that was new to him, as if he were wounded in a place that he had not known existed until now. He tried to dismiss it from his mind. He told himself, "I never had much time for girls, and I'm not starting now. What's the good?" There I'd sit, with my heart heavy with grief. And when I looked out at the moonlit moor by night, I would sometimes go out of myself in search of the place where my girl lay underground, because I brought her bad luck. By now, Krabat had learned the art of going out of himself. It was one of those few magic arts against which the master warned his men because, said he, you might easily happen to leave your body and never find your way back. And he impressed it upon his pupils that you could only go out of yourself after nightfall, and you could only return before dawn of the next day. If you delayed and stayed away longer, there was no going back. Your body would be closed to you and be buried for dead, while you yourself must wander restlessly between life and death, unable to show yourself, to speak, or make yourself known in any way at all. And that was the peculiar horror of it. Even the most insubstantial of poltergeists could at least do some knocking, or rattle pots and pans in the kitchen, or throw logs of wood at the wall. No, thought Krabat. Whatever may tempt me to go out of myself, I'll take good care not to do it. Juro had fallen silent. He was hunched by the fire, scarcely moving. If he had not put a branch on the embers now and then, or fed the fire with a piece of bark, Krabat would have thought he had fallen asleep. So midnight came. Once more, the Easter bells rang out, far away, and yet again a girl's voice was raised in song in the village of Schwarzkopf, a voice that Krabat knew, the voice he had been waiting for, the voice he had searched his memory for in vain. Now that he heard it, he wondered how he could ever have forgotten it. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Krabat listened to the girls singing in the village, and to the way the voices chimed in. Now the solo voice, then the chorus, and as the chorus sang, he was waiting for the solo voice to ring out again. I wonder what her hair is like, he found himself thinking. Is it brown, or black, or fair, as wheat? He longed to know. He longed to see the singer's face. Suppose I go out of myself, he thought, only for a few moments, just long enough to look into her face. And already he was reciting the spell, and felt himself shake free of his body as his breath left it. He went out into the black night. He cast a glance back at the fire, and Juro crouching by it, as if he would fall asleep any minute, and himself sitting upright against the cross, neither alive nor dead. All that went to make up Krabat's real life was out here now, outside that body. He felt free, light, and untrammeled, and alert, all his senses far more alert than ever before. Still, he hesitated to leave his body alone. There was still a last bond to be cut, It was not easy when he knew the separation could be forever. All the same, he turned away from the young man who bore his name, sitting by the fire, and set out for the village. No one heard Krabat. No one could see him, but he himself saw and heard everything with astonishing clarity. Still singing, the girls were walking up and down the village street with lanterns and Easter candles. They wore their communion dresses, all black, but for a white headband around the hair, which they wore parted in the middle and combed straight back. Krabat did as he would have done if he had been there in his body. He joined the village lads standing on either side of the street watching the girls, calling out to them and cracking jokes. "Sing a bit louder, can't you? We can hardly hear you. Watch out for those candles. You'll singe your noses. You're blue with cold? Why don't you come over here and get warm?" The girls acted as though the young men were not there at all. This was their night, and theirs alone. They went calmly on their way, singing up the street and down again. Later, they went into a farmhouse to warm up. The young men tried to follow them in, but the master of the house turned them away, and they crowded around the window to peer in. The girls were standing by the stove while the farmer's wife gave them Easter cakes and hot milk, and that was all the young men could see, because all of a sudden the farmer was back with a stout stick this time. "Shoo," said he, as if they were stray cats. "Be off with you, my lads, or you'll be sorry for it." The young men went away sulking, and Krabat went, too, although he had no need at all to do so. They waited nearby until the girls left the farmhouse and walked on. By now, Krabat knew that the singer had fair hair. She was tall and slender, and carried herself proudly, holding her head high. In fact, he could have rejoined Juro by the fire long ago. He ought to have rejoined Juro by the fire long ago. However, he had seen her only from a distance, from the roadside, and now he wanted to look into her eyes. Krabat became one with the flame of the candle that she was carrying. Now he was close to her, closer than he had ever been to any girl before. He was looking into a face that was young and very beautiful in the severe frame of her headband and cap. Her large, soft eyes looked down at him without seeing him, or did they? He knew it was high time to return to the fire, but the girl's eyes, so bright, fringed by such long lashes, kept him back. He could not tear himself away. He heard her voice only distantly. It did not matter now that he could look into her eyes. Krabat knew that morning was near, but he could not leave her. He knew his life was lost if he did not break away and return to his body in time. He knew it, but he could not make the effort. Until a sudden, sharp pain pierced through him, burning like fire, and wrenched him abruptly away. Krabat found himself back on the outskirts of the wood with Juro. A glowing piece of wood lay on the back of his hand, and he shook it off quickly. "Oh, Krabat," cried Juro. "I didn't mean to do that. You look so strange all of a sudden, so different." "I lit this torch and shone it in your face. How was I to know that ember would fall on your hand? How bad is it?" "It'll be all right," said Krabat. He spat on the burn. He could not tell Juro how thankful he was for his clumsiness. But for that burn, he would not be sitting here now. The pain on the back of his hand had made him return to his body as quick as thought, and not a moment too soon. "Day is breaking," said Krabat. "Let's cut the splinters of wood." They cut them and put them in the fire. "I mark you, brother, with wood from the cross. I mark you with the sign of the secret brotherhood." On their way back to the mill, they met the girls with their pitchers. For a moment, Krabat wondered whether to speak to the singer, but then he let it be. Juro was there, and besides, he did not want to frighten her. Chapter 5. The Tales of Big Hat. Once again they passed under the yoke at the door, received the blows on their cheeks, and promised to obey the master in all things. Krabat was not really attending. The singer's eyes haunted him, yet they had looked only at the light of an Easter candle, and never saw Krabat. I'll show myself to her another time, he decided. I want her to know it when she is looking at me. The last of the men had come back. The water was rushing down into the tail race, and the mill began to grind. The master herded his 12 men into the grinding room to set to work. Krabat did what had to be done, feeling as though it were not really he dragging sacks from the granary. Tipping grain into the hopper, a good deal of grain was spilled today and gradually beginning to sweat. He heard the master's voice, as if through a wall. It did not seem to concern him. A couple of times he collided with one of his companions by mistake, because his thoughts were so far away. Once he slipped on the bottom of the steps leading to the bin floor and hurt his knee. He hardly felt it, but rebalanced the sack that was threatening to slide off his shoulder and climbed on up. He was working like a horse. As time went on, his feet grew heavy. He felt the sweat dripping from him. He had to strain to lift the heavy sacks, but he did not mind. None of it really seemed to matter. All that was happening at the mill that morning was the business of the old Krabat, the one who had sat all night under the wooden cross. The other Krabat, the one who had been to Schwarzkopf, was indifferent to it. He felt he was a stranger here. None of this had anything to do with him, and he did not understand it. This time, it was Vitko who shouted out in delight first, and gave the signal for general rejoicing. Surprised, Krabat paused, then spat on his hands and made for the next sack. Juro dug him in the ribs. Stop, Krabat. Juro's elbow caught him in the exact spot under the left shoulder where it would hurt most. Krabat was breathless for a moment. Then he said, Hey, Juro, you idiot. I'll give you one on the nose for that. And now it was both Krabat speaking, gasping for breath. They laughed and drank and ate the rich, golden brown Easter cakes, and later on they danced. Rum, toom, thigh, toom. The wheel went around, and the miller was old, and his wits not sound, and as it chanced, in the month of May, he married him a young wife. One fine day, so around we go, as the wheel goes around, and the miller was old, and his wits not sound. They danced and sang, and Vitko bawled out the words of the songs as if he meant to outsing every one of them with his shrill, piping voice. Later, Stashko turned to Andrush and asked him to tell them a story. One of the tales of Big Hat, maybe, he suggested. Very well, said Andrush. Just pass the wine. He took a long pull at his tankard before beginning his story. Well, he began. One day Big Hat came to the mill at Schleif, and you must know that the miller there was a shocking old skinflint, but now I come to think of it, Vitko may not know who Big Hat is at all. It turned out that Vitko didn't know, and neither did Krabat. Then I must start by telling you about him, said Andrush, and he promised the others to keep it short. Well, said he, Big Hat is a journeyman miller, a wend like us, and I believe he comes from somewhere near Spala. He is tall, and he is thin, and so old that no one can say for sure just how old he is. But if you were to see him, you'd say he was about 40 years old, no more. He wears a gold ring in his left ear. A small, thin ring, you hardly see it unless the sun happens to shine on it. But to make up for that, his hat is enormous, with a broad brim and a pointed crown, and that's how he gets his name. It's by that hat that folks recognize him, or else don't recognize him. as you're about to hear. You must know, too, that Big Hat is a magician, perhaps the greatest magician there has ever been in Lusatia, and that's saying something. None of us here knows half as much of the art of arts as Big Hat has in his little finger. Yet he has remained a journeyman all his life, not wanting to be a master miller or anything greater, like a bailiff or a justice maybe, or a jurtier even, though he easily could have been if he had wanted. But there you are, he didn't. And why not? Because he's his own master, and so he means to remain, a free man going from mill to mill as it suits him in summertime, with no one to give him orders or take orders from him. That's what he likes. And by heaven, that's what I'd like too, if I could choose. The miller's men all agreed with Andrush. They would all have liked to live like Big Hat, every man his own master, with no need to dance to anyone's tune. They felt that more than ever today, when they had just renewed their promises to the master, and were bound to the mill in the fen of Kosel for another year. "Come on, Andrush, your story," cried Hansu. "Right you are, brother. I've been long enough getting started. Just hand me that jug again, and then listen." "Well," said Andrush, "so Big Hat comes to the mill at Schleif, and he goes up to the miller, who, as I was saying, was the very worst skinflint you ever saw. That man grudged the very butter on the bread and the salt in the soup, and because of that he was always having trouble with his men, since none of them wanted to stay. As everyone knows, you can't work well on poor food for long. So along comes Big Hat to this mill, asking for work. "Work enough," says the miller, and he might have guessed who it was standing there, with the pointed hat and the ring in his ear. But the fact is that those who have to do with Big Hat only remember later what they should have noticed at once. The miller of Schleif didn't notice, for one. So Big Hat hires himself out to this miller for 3 weeks. Well, there were 2 other men there, and an apprentice boy thin as sticks, all 3 of them with swollen legs from drinking so much water. There was plenty of water to be had at that mill, but that was the only thing the miller didn't begrudge them. They were kept short of bread, and even shorter of oatmeal, and there was no meat or bacon at all, only cheese sometimes, and now and then half a herring. The 3 of them worked like slaves, because they were poor fellows, and the miller had a paper they had signed saying they owed him money, so they couldn't run away. Big Hat watched all this for a while. He heard the apprentice crying with hunger every evening until he fell asleep. He saw the 2 journeymen washing at the pump every morning, and they were so thin that the sun shone through them. Then one day, while they were eating their dinner, the mill was running on, for they had just tipped in some buckwheat, which was still being ground in. Comes the master just as they're drinking their soup. A thin brew, that soup with nettles in it, and pigweed, and 5 or 6 caraway seeds, maybe even 7. This was Big Hat's moment to tackle the miller. "Hey there, master," says he, pointing to his soup bowl. "I've been here 2 weeks now, and I've had a chance to see what you give folks to eat at your mill. Come now, don't you think it's rather poor? Try it yourself." And he offers him his spoon. Well, the miller acts as if he can't make out what Big Hat is saying on account of the noise of the mill. He just points to his ears, shakes his head and grins, but the grin was wiped off his face soon enough, for Big Hat knows a trick or two. Big Hat brings the flat of his hand down on the table, and all at once, click. The mill stands still, quite still too, with no clattering or rumbling as it runs down. The water is surging through the tail race, beating against the paddles of the wheel, so it can't be because of someone cranking the sluice down. Some part of the machinery must be stuck, and the miller's praying it isn't the cogwheel or the main shaft. Once he gets over his first fright, the miller is in great alarm. "Quick," cries he, "quick, quick." Boy, you go and close the sluice. The rest of us will go and see what's wrong with the mill. But hurry, hurry, in heaven's name." "No need for that," says Big Hat calmly. And this time he does the grinning. "What?" says the miller. "Why not?" "Because it was I that stopped the mill." "You?" "I am Big Hat." As if to order, a sunbeam falls through the window and flashes on a certain gold ring in a certain ear. "You're Big Hat." The miller's knees are knocking. He knows how Bigot treats master millers who starve and plague their men. Good heavens, he thinks. How came I not to notice it when he asked for work? Have I been blind all this time? Big Hat sends him to get paper and ink, and then he writes out what the miller is to give his men from now on. 1/2 pound of bread a day, good weight. Every morning, thick gruel made of wheat or millet, buckwheat or barley, cooked in milk with sugar on Sundays and holidays. At dinner time, plenty of meat and vegetables for everyone twice a week, and on the other days, peas pudding, or beans and bacon, or roasted dumplings, or some other nourishing food, whatever is to be had, and plenty of it, with all the proper seasoning. He wrote and wrote, and it was a long list, laying down exactly what the miller of Schleif was to give his men in the future. "Put your name to that," said Big Hat, when the list was done, "and swear to do as it says." So knowing he had no choice, the miller put his name to the paper and swore. Then Big Hat took the spell off the mill. Bang! Went his hand on the table, and the mill was working again. He gave the list to one of the journeymen to keep, and he said to the miller, this time the miller could hear him quite clearly. "In spite of the noise of the mill, let's be sure we understand each other, master. You've sworn a solemn oath. Mind you don't break that oath when I leave, or else," and click, the mill stood still again, with not a rattle or a clatter as it ran down, so that the miller was petrified with fright. "But," said Big Hat, "the mill will stand still forever. Then no one will ever be able to get it going again. Just remember that." So saying, he set the mill working once more and went his way. Ever since then, folks say, the men who work at the mill in Schleif have lived off the fat of the land. They get properly fed. None of them goes hungry, and their legs are no longer swollen with water. The miller's men all liked Andrush's story. "Go on," they demanded. "Tell us more. Have another drink, and then let's hear some more about Big Hat." Andrush raised his tankard to his lips to moisten his throat, and then he went on telling tales of Big Hat, and how he paid out the master millers in Butzen and Sorau, in Rumberg and Schluckenau, all for fun and to do the miller's men good. Krabat found himself thinking of their own master and his journey to Dresden to visit the Elector, and he wondered how it would be if Big Hat ever came to visit the master of the mill in the fen. If it came to a trial of strength between them, which of the two would win? Chapter 6. Horse Trading. After Easter, they began to overhaul all the woodwork of the mill. The master put Stashko in charge since he was the most skillful carpenter among them, with Keto and Krabat as his assistants. They inspected everything that was made of wood, from the meal store to the roof, and where they found anything in need of repair, a post that was about to break, a loose board, woodworm in the flooring, the three of them replaced it or repaired the damage. There was a lot of work to be done on the woodwork down by the mill race. The weir needed rebuilding, and they were to make a completely new water wheel too. Stashko and his assistants did nearly all the work with their hatchets, as self-respecting journeyman millers would always do, reaching for a saw only when it was absolutely necessary, and then reluctantly. Krabat was glad he had work that hardly allowed him time to think of anything else, that is to say, the singer of Schwarzkolm. All the same, He found himself thinking of her quite often, and sometimes he was afraid the others would notice. Lishko was already suspicious, for one. One day he asked Krabat what was the matter with him. "The matter?" asked Krabat. "What do you mean?" "Well, these days you hardly listen when anyone speaks to you." "I once knew a man who was in trouble over a girl. He was the same way. And I once knew a man who could hear the grass growing," said Krabat, as casually as he could. Or so he said, but it was just the straw crackling inside his head. Krabat was working hard in the black school, and soon he knew as much of the secret arts as most of his fellow journeymen. Only Hanzo, Merton, and Michael were still ahead of him, especially Michael, who had been a star pupil ever since the new year, and had far outstripped all the others. The miller was obviously pleased with Krabat's industry. He often praised him and encouraged him to keep it up. "I can tell that you'll go far," he said one Friday evening in May, after the lesson. "In my opinion, you have more aptitude for the secret arts than most, or I'd never have taken you to the elector's court with me." Krabat was proud of the master's praise. He was only sorry he didn't have more chance to make use of the knowledge of magic he had gained. "Well, we can put that right," said the master, as if he could hear Krabat's thoughts. "Tomorrow you will go to Wittichenau Market with Juro and sell him as a black stallion for 50 guilders. But mind that fool Juro doesn't give you any trouble." Next day, Krabat and Juro set off for Wittichenau. Krabat was thinking of Master Blash from Kamenz and whistling to himself. Horse dealing promised to be good fun. He thought it strange when he realized Juro was getting steadily unhappier as they went along. "What's the matter?" he asked. "What do you mean? You look as if you were going to the gallows." "What's to become of me?" asked Juro, blowing his nose. "I'll never do it, Krabat. I never turned myself into a horse before." "It can't be all that difficult, Juro," said Krabat. "I'll help you." "But what good will that do?" Juro had stopped and was looking at him sadly. "All right, so we turn me into a horse. You sell me for 50 guilders. And that's that for you, Krabat, but not for me." "And why not?" "Simple. How do I change back from being a horse without your help? It's almost as if the master puts me into this fix to get rid of me." "Good gracious, what nonsense you do talk," said Krabat. "No, I don't," said Juro. "I'll never do it. I'm far too stupid." He looked a picture of misery sitting there hanging his head. "Well, suppose we change places," suggested Krabat. "So long as the master gets his money, that's the main thing. He can't mind which of us sells which." Juro was delighted. "Would you really do a thing like that for me, Krabat?" "Never mind that," said Krabat. "Just promise not to tell anyone, and the rest of it should be easy." They went on their way, whistling, until they saw the roofs of Wittichenau ahead. Then they turned off the road and went behind a barn. "This is a good spot," said Krabat. "No one will see us here when I turn myself into a black horse. Now, you know that you mustn't sell me for less than 50 guilders, not on any account. And before you let me go, take the halter off me, or I'll have to stay a horse all my life, and I don't fancy the idea of that." "Never fear," said Juro. "I'll remember. Stupid I may be, but not that stupid." "Good," said Krabat. "Don't forget then." Muttering a magic spell, he changed himself into a black horse with a magnificent saddle and bridle. "Just look at you," cried Juro. "You should be on parade." The horse dealers in Wittichenau Market opened their eyes and mouths wide and came running up when they saw the black stallion. "How much?" they asked. 50 guilders. Before long, a dealer from Bautzen was willing to pay the asking price. Then, just as Juro was about to cry, Done. A stranger joined in the bargaining. He was a gentleman who looked like a man of rank, or a retired army officer, wearing a Polish cap and a red riding coat with silver lacing. "You're going to make a bad bargain there," said he to Juro in a hoarse voice. "Why, your stallion's worth far more than 50 guilders. I'd give you 100. The dealer from Butson was furious. Why did this crack-brained fellow have to cross his path? Who was he anyway? No one knew the stranger who looked like a nobleman, but was not no one but Krabat. Krabat had recognized him at once, by the patch over his left eye and by his voice. He blew out his nostrils and pranced back and forth. If only he could warn Juro. But Juro did not seem to notice Krabat's uneasiness. He was thinking of the 100 guilders. "Why do you hesitate?" The stranger pressed him, and bringing out a purse, he tossed it to the young man. Juro bowed. "Thank you kindly, sir." Next moment, the stranger made a grab for the halter, tore it out of the bewildered Juro's hands, and with one leap, he was up on Krabat's back, digging the spurs into his flanks so hard that the horse reared, whinnying. "Stop, sir, stop," cried Juro. "The halter. You have to leave me the halter." "Certainly not." The stranger burst out laughing, and then even Juro recognized him. Bringing his riding whip down hard on Krabat, the master cried, "Gee up there!" And taking no more notice of Juro, he shot away. Poor Krabat. The master rode him hard all over the moor, over stock and stone, over hedges and ditches, through thorns and mire. "I'll teach you to disobey me," he cried. When Krabat flagged, the miller cut him with the whip, driving the spurs in so deep that the young man felt as if red-hot nails were being driven into his flesh. Krabat tried to shake the master off. He bucked. He tore at the bridle. He stopped dead. "Try it. Go ahead. Try it," shouted the master. "You won't throw me." Using his whip and spurs, he wore Krabat out. One last attempt to throw off his rider failed, and Krabat gave up the fight. His mane was dark with sweat, and there was foam at his mouth. His whole body was steaming, and he was trembling and wheezing. Blood flowed from his flanks. He could feel the warmth of it running down the inside of his thighs. "That's better," said the master. He collected Krabat, and then made him trot. A gallop to the right, a gallop to the left, back again at a gentle trot, a short way at a walking pace. And then they stopped. You might have made that easier for yourself. The miller dismounted and untied the halter. "Now turn yourself back into a man." Krabat changed back, but he was still covered with welts, cuts, wounds, and bruises. "That's the punishment for your disobedience. When I send you on an errand, you're to carry it out, exactly as I told you and no other way. You won't get off so lightly another time. Remember that?" There could be no doubt that the master meant what he said. "And one thing more." He raised his voice a little. "No one's stopping you from getting your own back on Juro. There you are." He pressed his riding crop into the young man's hand. Then he turned to go, and after taking a few steps, he rose into the air as a hawk and soared swiftly away. Krabat limped homeward. He had to stop after every few steps he took. Leaden weights seemed to hang on his feet. Every bone in his body hurt. Every muscle was painful. When he reached the Wittich road, he let himself drop in the shadow of the nearest tree and rested. What would the girl from Schwarzkopf say if she could see him now? After a while, Juro came jogging along the road, very subdued, looking guilty. "Hey there, Juro," Krabat called. The poor fellow was alarmed. "Is that really you, then?" "Yes," said Krabat. "It's really me." Juro retreated a step, pointing to the riding crop with one hand and shielding his face with the other. I suppose you're going to thrash me? I ought to, said Krabat. That's what the master expects me to do anyway. Hurry up then, said Juro. I've deserved my beating. I like to get it over with. Krabat pushed the hair back from his forehead. Would it make my own skin heal any faster, do you think? What about the master, though? He didn't order me to thrash you, said Krabat. It was just a suggestion. Come here and sit down beside me, Juro. Very well, said Juro. He took something that looked like a piece of wood out of his pocket, and with it, he drew a circle around the place where they were sitting. Then he drew 3 crosses and a pentagram within the circle. What are you doing? Asked Krabat. Oh, nothing, said Juro evasively. It's just to protect us against gnats and midges. I don't like to be bothered with them. Let's have a look at your back. So saying, he lifted Krabat's shirt. Dear me, the master gave you a bad time and no mistake. Whistling through his teeth, he searched his pockets. I ought to have some ointment here. I always carry it with me. It's a recipe of my grandmother's. Would you like me to put some on your back? If it'll do any good, said Krabat. At least it can't do any harm, Juro assured him. Carefully, he rubbed the ointment into Krabat's wounds. It was pleasantly cool and made the pain fade quickly. Krabat felt as if he were growing a new skin. What wonderful ointment, he cried in surprise. Ah, well, my granny, said Juro. Now she was a clever woman. We're a very clever family, Krabat, all but me. When I think that you might have had to stay a horse all your life because of my folly, he shuddered and closed his eyes. Stop that, Krabat told him. We were lucky after all. They went peaceably home together, and when they were almost through the fen, just before they reached the mill, Juro began to limp. You'd better limp too, Krabat. Why? We don't want the master to know about that ointment. We don't want anyone else at all to know. What about you? Asked Krabat. Why are you limping? Because you gave me a thrashing, and don't you forget it. Chapter 7. Wine and Water. They began to build the water wheel at the end of June. Krabat helped Stashko measure the old mill wheel, since the new one must be exactly the same in all its parts. When it was finished, they were going to fit it on the existing axle-tree. Their carpenter's shop was behind the stable, between the barn and the shed, and they spent all their time there now, making the wheel, the spokes, and the felloes forming the outer rim, the paddles and the pegs that held them in place. Stashko showed them how to do it. Everything must be just right, he told his assistants, or we'll be a laughingstock the day we set the new wheel in place. It was light until late in the evening now, and in fine weather, the miller's men would often sit out of doors, outside the mill, while Andrush played his Jew's harp. These days, Krabat felt he would like to go to Schwarzkolm again. Maybe the singer would be sitting outside her house. Maybe she would wave in reply to his greeting as he went by. Or perhaps she was with the other village girls, and they were singing again. Many evenings, when the wind was blowing from Schwarzkolm, he thought he could hear singing in the distance, but that couldn't really be possible, not with the wood in between. If he could only find some excuse to get away, a good, innocent reason that would not arouse even Lishko's suspicions, it was possible that such a reason might present itself some day, and then he would not be making anyone suspicious, and so placing the girl in danger. When all was said and done, he knew very little about her. He knew what she looked like now, the way she walked and held her head, and the sound of her voice. He knew all this, as well as if he had always known it. He knew, too, that he could never put her out of his mind and out of his life again, no more than he could banish the memory of Tonda. Yet he did not even know her name. Now and then he wondered what it was, and it gave him pleasure to think of a name for her. Malenka, Radushka, Dushenka was a good name. It would suit her. And it's as well I don't know her real name, thought Krabat. For if I don't know it, I can't give it away, not awake, nor in my sleep, as Tonda made me promise. It seems 1,000 years ago that we sat by the fire that Easter night, he and I. Krabat still had not visited Tonda's grave. One summer's day he woke at the first light of dawn, stole out of the mill, and went out into the fen. There were dewdrops hanging on every blade of grass and every twig, and wherever Krabat passed, he left a dark trail in the grass behind him. At sunrise he came to the edge of the waste ground, not far from the spot where he and Tonda first reached firm land when they were coming back from the peat cutting. On the way, Krabat had picked a few ragged robin flowers from the bank of a pool in the swamp to put on Tonda's grave. But when he saw the row of long, low mounds ahead of him in the morning sunlight, they were all alike. There was no way to tell them apart. Was Tonda buried to the left of the row or to the right? And the mounds were not evenly spaced, so it could be that Tonda's grave lay somewhere in the middle. Krabat was at a loss. He could not remember anything that might give him a clue. The day they buried Tonda, everything around them had been white, covered with snow. That's that, then, he thought. He walked slowly past the mounds, laying a flower on each one. At the end, there was one flower left over. He twisted its stem in his fingers and said, looking down at it, "For the next man we bury here." He let the flower fall, and it was only then, in the brief time it took to reach the ground, that he realized what he had just said. He felt a thrill of horror, but there was no unsaying it now, and the flower lay where it fell, at the far end of the row, between the mound on the extreme right and the wood. Back in the mill, no one seemed to know where Krabat had been, yet someone had been watching him secretly after all. Michael. That evening, he spoke to Krabat in private. "The dead are dead," said Michael. "I told you so once before and tell you so again. Those who die at the mill in the fen of Kassel are forgotten, as if they had never been. That's the only way the others can go on living, and life must go on. Promise me to remember that." "I promise," said Krabat, and he nodded. But even as he nodded, he knew he neither could nor would keep that promise. Work on the new water wheel took a full 3 weeks in all. They did not use a single nail. The parts were all made to fit exactly and mortised together. Later, when they brought the wheel to the water, the tenons would swell and hold better than any glue. For the last time, Stashko checked that the measurements were all exact and nothing left undone. Then he went to tell the master that the wheel was ready. The master fixed the next Wednesday as the day to set the wheel in place. By rights, he ought now to have sent word to all the other millers in those parts, inviting them and their journeymen to his mill on the great day that was the custom. But the master of the mill in the fen did not hold with such customs, and he did not care a hang for the other local millers. "What do we want with strange folks at our mill?" said he. "We can set the wheel in place well enough by ourselves." Stashko, Krabat, and Keto had plenty to do before Wednesday. The old water wheel and the tail race had to be covered with good, strong scaffolding. They had to see that the ropes, winch, and pulley were in order, and to provide poles on which to carry the wheel, levers, and so forth. On Tuesday evening, the miller's men wove leaves through the spokes of the new wheel, and Stashko added a few flowers as a finishing touch. He was proud of his work and didn't mind showing it. Wednesday began with bacon cakes for breakfast. Thinks I to myself, "You'll get down to work better with something good inside you," said Juro as he served them out. "So eat your fill, but don't overeat now." After breakfast, they went off to their carpenter's shop, where they found the master waiting for them. They passed poles through the wheel, as Stashko had shown them. 3 on one side of the hub, and 3 on the other. "Ready," called Stashko. "Ready," cried the miller and his men. "Good luck then. Off we go. Lift away." So they carried the wheel off to the mill race and put it down on the grass beside the scaffolding. "Gently, now," said Stashko. "Take it easy. Mind, it doesn't slip out of joint." Michael and Merton clambered up on the scaffolding, and with the help of the pulley and several ropes, they shifted the axle tree and secured it to the crossbeam behind the old wheel. Now, using poles and levers, the men lifted the mill wheel off the axle and out of the tail race and carried it away. The new water wheel was set upright, brought over to the tail race, and lowered into it until the hub was level with the axle tree. They now had to fit the hub of the wheel onto the axle. Stashko was sweating with excitement. He had climbed right down into the tail race, along with Andrush, and was issuing orders from there. "Over to the left a bit. Take it slowly. Now a little lower. To the right. Mind you don't topple it over." Up until now, all had gone well, but suddenly Andrush struck his hands together and uttered an oath. "Just look at that," he called to Stashko. "See what a mess you made of it." And he pointed to the hole in the middle of the hub. "You might get a broomstick through it, maybe, but the axle will never fit in." Stashko, horrified, went red as fire. He had measured everything so carefully and precisely, and in spite of that, the hole in the hub was far too small. So small that even Juro couldn't help but see it. I can't understand it," stammered Stashko. "Can't you?" asked Andrush. "Not for the life of me," said Stashko. "Well, I can," said Andrush, grinning. By now, the others had all realized he was just playing a trick on Stashko. He snapped his fingers, and at once, everything was all right again. The hole in the hub was the right size. And when they placed the wheel on the axle, it fitted like a glove. Stashko bore Andrush no ill will for his trick. He was glad the most difficult part of the job was over. By comparison, the rest was child's play. They restored the axle to its usual position and took the ropes away. Then the wheel was driven firmly onto the axle tree and the wedges knocked in. A few blows with a mallet, and it was done. The miller had been lending a hand like all the others. Now he climbed up on the scaffolding and told Juro to bring him some wine. Standing above the tail race, the master raised his tankard, drank to his men, and poured the rest of his wine over the garlanded wheel. "First wine, then water," he cried. "Start it going." Hanzo opened the sluice, and to the acclamation of the miller's men, the new wheel began to go around. After their work, the men carried the long table and the benches from the servants' hall out to the yard in front of the mill, and Lishko helped Vitko bring out the master's armchair, which they set at the head of the table. Then they washed in the mill pond, and while the other men cleaned up and put on fresh shirts and smocks, Juro was making the final preparations for a festive meal. There was roast meat and wine to celebrate the setting of the new wheel in place. They sat out in the open until late in the evening. The master was in a good mood and feeling talkative. He praised Stashko and his assistants for their work, and even had a good word for stupid Juro. He told him the roast was excellent, and the wine did him good. He sang and cracked jokes with his men, urged them to drink, and he himself drank most of all. "Be merry," he shouted. "Be merry, my lads. Anyone who saw you might well be envious. You don't know your luck. What us?" cried Andrush, clapping a hand to his head. Listen to that, friends. The master envies us. I envy you, your youth. All of a sudden, the master was serious, but not for long. He began to tell them a story of the days when he himself was a journeyman miller, and about Krabat's age. I had a good friend in those days, called Jerko. We learned our trade together at the mill in Komaro, and then we went on our travels together, all over Lusatia, into Schleswig, as far as Bohemia. When we came to a miller's place, we always asked if he had work for two of us. It would never have done for us to be separated, Jerko and I. It was better to stick together, and merrier too. Jerko always saw that we had something to laugh at, and how he could work. He could work for three if he had to. As for the way the girls ran after us, you'd never believe it. The master was in full swing. Now and then he paused to drink, and then picked up the thread of his story again and went on. He told how one day he and Jerko came to a black school, how they spent 7 years learning the magic arts, and when that time was over, they began to travel around the country once again. And so, said the master, we took service at a mill near Coswig, and the elector came riding by with a hunting party one day and stopped to rest in the meadow behind the mill pond, in the shade of the trees. We journeymen, Jerko and myself included, stood behind the bushes, watching them eat. 2 servants had spread a tablecloth on the grass, and the elector and his guests sat around it and ate from silver plates, which the servants put before them. There were quail pasties with truffles, and game, and 3 sorts of wine to drink, and after that there were sweetmeats, and they had brought it all with them in enormous baskets, loaded on pack horses. Well, when the elector, he was a young man himself, at the time when he and the ladies and gentlemen had had enough to eat, he gave a loud belch just to show he'd eaten well. Then he said this meal out of doors had done him so much good, he felt as strong as 12 oxen. And seeing us young fellows standing gaping in the bushes, he shouted out to us for someone to bring him a horseshoe, and quickly, or he burst with his own strength. We knew that the elector was said to be able to break a horseshoe with his bare hands crack, right down the middle, so we could guess why he wanted one. And Jerko ran to the mill and fetched him a horseshoe from the stable. Here you are, your most serene highness. The elector grasped the horseshoe by both ends. The huntsmen, who were sitting a little way off with the horses and hounds, had already jumped up, pursed their lips, and raised their horns. And at the moment when the elector broke the horseshoe, they began to blow with all their might, puffing out their cheeks like bellows. To the sound of the hunting horns, the elector held up the 2 halves of the horseshoe and showed them to the company. Then he asked the gentlemen in his hunting party if any of them could do it. Well, they all said no to that. But Jerko was feeling his oats. He went right up to the elector and claimed, "By your leave, I can put the horseshoe together again." "Any blacksmith can do as much," says the elector. "With a pair of bellows and a fire in his forge, yes," Jerko grants him. Not with his bare hands. Without waiting for the elector's reply, he just took the 2 halves of the horseshoe away from him. Then, pressing the broken surfaces together, he spoke a charm. "There, if it please you," said he. The elector snatched the shoe out of his hand and examined it. It was whole again, all of a piece. "Humph," growled the elector. "You can't fool us into thinking that will hold." He tried to break the horseshoe for the 2nd time, thinking it couldn't be hard to do, but he was reckoning without Jerko. He tugged and tugged at that shoe until the veins of his throat stood out like ropes. Sweat was dripping from his brow, and his eyes were bulging out of his head. First, he went red in the face as a turkey cock, then purple, and finally dark blue. His lips were white with the strain, thin and white as 2 chalk lines. Then, suddenly, His Highness, the Elector, dropped the horseshoe and was yellow as a quince with anger. "To horse," he ordered. "We'll ride on." His Most Serene Highness was so unsteady on his feet he could hardly get into the saddle. And ever after that he gave the mill near Coswig a very wide berth indeed. The master went on drinking and telling tales, tales of his life when he was a young man, and tales of Jerko, until Michael asked him what had become of this Jerko. By then, it was late. The stars were in the sky, and the moon was rising behind the stable roof. What became of Jerko? The master clasped his tankard in both hands. "I brought him to his death." That made the young men sit up. "Yes, I brought him to his death," repeated the master. "And one of these days I'll tell you how it happened. But now I'm thirsty. Wine, more wine." The master drank steadily on, without another word, until he fell back in his chair, rigid as a corpse. The sight of him filled the men with dread. They could not bring themselves to carry him into the house. They left him sitting there until he woke of his own accord next morning and crawled off to bed. Chapter 8. The Cockfight. Now and then, traveling journeymen would come to the mill in the fen and ask the miller for food and lodging. That was the custom, and it was their right to ask it, not that they had much luck with the master. Though he was in duty bound to give the travelers food for a day and shelter for the night, he did not observe the customs of his guild. Instead, he showed them the door with harsh words. "I want nothing to do with a pack of waifs and strays," he snapped at them. "I have neither bread nor gruel for the likes of you, and you'd better get out at once, or I'll set the dogs on you and hunt you all the way to Schwarzcombe." This was generally enough to get rid of the unwanted guests, but if one of them turned awkward, the miller knew how to make the poor fellow believe he was being chased by dogs, whereupon he would strike out frantically with his staff and make off, yelling. "We don't need snoopers here," the master used to say. "We can do without useless mouths to feed, too." It was a heavy, sultry day in high summer. A haze hung over the fen, and the air was so close that it was difficult to breathe. A strong smell of weeds and stagnant water rose from the mill race. Soon a storm would break. Krabat had settled down after dinner in the shade of the willows, on the bank of the mill pond. He was lying on his back in the grass, chewing a stalk, with his hands clasped behind his neck. He felt tired and sleepy, and his eyes closed. Just as he was dozing off, he heard someone come up the path whistling loudly. When he opened his eyes, he saw a traveling journeyman before him. The stranger was a tall, thin man, rather middle-aged, with skin as dark as a gypsy's. He was wearing an odd sort of tall, pointed hat and a narrow gold ring in his left ear. But otherwise he looked like any other journeyman miller on his travels, with wide linen trousers, a hatchet in his belt, and his bundle on a strap over his left shoulder. "Good day, brother," said he. "Good day," said Krabat, yawning. "Where are you from, and where are you going?" "I've come from there, and I'm going thither," said the stranger. "Take me to your master." "You'll find him in his room," replied Krabat lazily. "First door on the left when you get into the hall. You can't miss it." The stranger regarded Krabat with a mocking smile. "Just do as I ask, brother. Take me to him." Krabat felt an irresistible power issuing from the stranger. It forced him to get up and show the man the way, as he was asked. The miller was sitting in his room, at the head of the table, and he looked up in annoyance when Krabat brought the stranger in. But the man did not seem at all disturbed. "By your leave," said he, raising his hat. "Good day to you, master. And according to the custom of the guild, I ask for lodging for the night and food for my journey." The master showed him the door in his usual way. But the stranger took no notice. "Never mind all that about the dogs," said he. "I know you don't have any. May I sit down?" And without more ado, he sat down on the chair at the foot of the table. Krabat simply could not understand it. Why was the master putting up with such treatment? Normally he'd be up on his feet, chasing the stranger away from the mill with a stick if need be. Why not this time? The two men sat there in silence, staring at one another across the table. They looked dangerous, as if they would be at each other's throats any moment, knives drawn. Outside there was the first growl of thunder. Still far away, a muffled growl, only just audible. Then Hanzo came through the door, followed by Michael and Merton. One by one, the miller's men came into the room, until they were all present. Later, they told each other that they suddenly wanted to see the master. Quite by chance, the same idea had occurred to every one of them, and brought them in. The storm was coming closer. A gust of wind rattled the window frames, and there was a flash of lightning. Pursing his lips, the stranger spat on the table, and where he spat, there was a red mouse sitting. "Now, Miller, beat that, if you can." The master spat, and there was a black mouse on the table, one-eyed, like the miller himself. The mice circled one another on nimble paws, trying to bite each other's tails. Just as the black mouse was about to sink its teeth in, the stranger snapped his fingers. Where the red mouse had been, there was now a red tomcat crouched ready to spring. In an instant, the black mouse turned into a tomcat too, black and one-eyed. Spitting with their claws out, the two went for each other, clawing, biting, and clawing again. The red cat was aiming for the black cat's eye. Yowling, he pounced upon his enemy and almost scratched it out. This time, it was the master who snapped his fingers, and instead of the black cat, there was a black rooster on the table. Beating its wings, slashing with beak and claws, it attacked the red cat, making it flinch back, but not far. For now, the stranger snapped his fingers again. There were two roosters facing one another on the table, a black one and a red one, combs swollen, feathers ruffled. Outside the storm broke, but the miller's men took no notice of it. A furious fight broke out between the two roosters. Fluttering wildly, they flung themselves into the fray. There was a flurry of thrusts with beak and spurs. They flapped their wings, making the feathers fly, and screeched and crowed. Finally, the red rooster managed to get on the black one's back. He dug his spurs into his enemy's feathers, tearing at him unmercifully, striking out furiously with his beak until the black rooster turned to escape. The red rooster chased him through half the mill and out into the fen. There was one last tremendous flash of lightning, and a roll of thunder like 1,000 drums. Then there came a sudden lull with no sound but the rain beating down outside the windows. "You've lost, Miller," said the stranger. "Now then, I'm hungry. Bring me something to eat, and don't forget the wine." White as a sheet, the master rose from his chair. With his own hands, he brought the stranger bread and ham, smoked meat and cheese, pickled cucumber and onions. Then he fetched a pitcher of red wine from the cellar. "Too sharp," said the stranger, tasting it. "Bring me some wine from the little cask in the right-hand corner at the back, the one you've been keeping for special occasions." This is a special occasion. Grinding his teeth, the miller obeyed orders. He had lost the contest and must submit. The stranger enjoyed his meal while the master and his men watched. They were rooted to the spot, unable to take their eyes off him. At last he pushed his plate away, wiped his lips with his sleeve, and sighed. "Oh, that was good. And there was plenty of it, too. Your very good health, brothers." He raised his tankard and drank to the journeyman. "As for you," he advised the master, "you'd better look more closely before showing strangers the door. Another time you can take Big Hat's word for that." So saying, he rose, picked up his hatchet and his bundle, and went out of the mill. Krabat and the other men followed him, leaving the master alone. Outside, the storm had passed over. The sun shone over the fen, and steam was rising from the ground. The air was fresh as spring water. Big Hat went on his way without looking back. He crossed the wet meadow, going toward the wood and whistling to himself. Once or twice his gold earring caught the sun. "Didn't I tell you?" said Andrush. Those who have dealings with Big Hat don't notice till later what they'd have done better to notice before. The miller shut himself up in the black room for 3 days and 3 nights, and his men crept about the house on tiptoe. They had been present when Big Hat defeated the master in a contest of magic, and they could guess there were bad times ahead. Their troubles began on the evening of the 4th day. The master appeared in the servants' hall at supper time and dragged the 12 of them away from their plates to work. He must have been drinking. They could smell it on his breath. He stood there, hollow-cheeked, pale as death, his face unshaven. "What? Not in the grinding room yet? Must I help you? Off with you? Get the mill grinding, dip in the grain. We'll set all the millstones going, and if there's any dawdling, it'll be the worse for you." The men had to toil away at their work all night, unmercifully driven by the master. Shouting and cursing, he chased them back and forth, uttering oaths, threatening punishment until they were almost fainting. There was not a break all night long, not a moment to draw breath. When at last day dawned, the men were dropping with exhaustion. They felt as if every bone in their bodies had been broken, and they were all gasping for breath. The master sent them up to their beds to rest. He left them in peace all day, but it was the same story that evening, and so it went on, night after night. As dark fell, the master would drive them into the grinding room, and they had to slave away to the sound of his jeers and curses until the next day dawned. Friday night was their only respite, because their Friday evening lessons still went on, though the men were so tired that they could hardly keep awake as they sat on their perch in the shape of ravens, and many of them did fall asleep from weariness. That did not trouble the master. What they learned, and how much they learned, was their own affair. It was only once, when Vitko fell off the perch in his sleep, that the master reproved him. Vitko, who was still growing, was suffering more than the others, and their nightly drudgery affected him most. Michael and Merton did try to help the boy, and when they could, Hanzo, Krabat, and Stashko also lent him a hand, but the master was everywhere, and not much escaped his one eye. They never spoke of Big Hat, but the men knew the master was punishing them for witnessing his defeat. Things went on like this for 6 weeks, until the first night of the new moon, in September. The goodman with the feather in his hat came driving up as usual. The men set to work. The master climbed up on the box, picked up the whip, and cracked it. In silence, the men ran from the cart to the mill with their sacks, tipped the contents into the hopper above the dead stones, and hurried back to the cart. Everything happened as it usually did at the new moon, though it was all rather worse for them, and about 2 in the morning, Vitko could not go on. Carrying one of the last sacks, he began to stagger and collapsed halfway between the cart and the mill, where he lay face downward in the grass, gasping for breath. Michael turned him over and tore his shirt open. "You there!" The master jumped up. "What's the meaning of this?" "How can you ask?" Straightening up, Michael broke the silence they always observed on nights of the new moon. "You've made us work like slaves night after night. For 6 whole weeks. How could the boy stand it?" "Quiet!" shouted the master. He struck out with his whip. The lash curled around Michael's throat. "Let be." It was the first time Krabat had heard the stranger speak. His voice was like red-hot coals and bitter frost in one. Krabat felt it run down his back like an icy shudder, and at the same time he felt he was standing in the flames of a blazing fire. The figure with the plumed hat made a gesture to Michael to take Vitko away. Then he took the whip from the master's hand and pushed him down from the cart. Michael put the boy to bed, and the miller had to work along with his men instead of Vitko for the rest of the night, which he usually had to do only between New Year and Easter. And as for his men, they thought it served him right. Chapter 9. The End of the Row. The next day, the miller left his men in peace, and only the welt on Michael's throat was left to remind them how hard the master had driven them for weeks, night after night. Now they could go about their work in daylight again, which gave them no trouble to speak of, and they stopped at nightfall, when they could do as they pleased. Play the Jew's harp, tell stories, whittle spoons. Everything was the same as before. The blisters on their hands dried up. The sore places on their chests and backs soon healed. When the master read to them from the Book of Necromancy on Friday evening, they were eager to learn again. When he asked questions, Juro was usually the only one to get stuck, and that was nothing new. A few days after Michaelmas, the master sent Peter and Krabat to Hoyerswerda to buy a cask of salt and all sorts of other kitchen stuff. The miller never let one of his men out on his own. If there was something to be done in the outside world, he sent at least two together, and it was to be supposed he had his reasons for that, or else his instructions. So the two of them set off at dawn in the rack wagon, with the bays between the shafts. It was misty over the fen, but once they had the wood behind them, the sun rose and the mist dispersed. Schwarzkolm lay ahead of them. Krabat was hoping to catch sight of the singer, and he looked out for her as they drove through the village, but in vain. She was not among the girls standing by the lower well with their buckets, chattering, nor at the upper well, nor was she anywhere else to be seen that morning. Krabat was sorry. He would have liked to see her again. Easter night was a long time ago. Perhaps I will be in luck when we go home this afternoon, he thought. Maybe it would be better not to hope, and then he needn't be disappointed later. But as they were going home from Hoyerswerda with their cask of salt and the other things that afternoon, his wish was granted after all. There she was, standing not far from the lower of the two village wells, surrounded by a flock of cackling chickens. She had a basket in her hand, and she was scattering food for them. Chick, chick, chick. Chick, chick, chick. Krabat recognized her at first glance, and as they drove by, he nodded to her, quite casually because he did not want Peter noticing anything. The girl nodded back, in an equally casual though friendly way, as one nods to a passing stranger, but her mind was on the chickens she was feeding. There was a fine speckled rooster among the chickens, busily pecking up the grain at her feet. Just then Krabat envied that rooster with all his heart, and if it had been possible, he would have changed places with him on the spot. The weather was dreary before winter set in that year, chilly and gray, with mist and rain. They used the few dry days to bring in peat, and spent the rest of their time in the mill, the shed, and the stable, the granary, or the barn. Everyone was glad to have work that would not take him out in the rain. Vitko had grown a lot since spring, but he was still thin. We'll have to put a brick on his head to weigh him down, or he'll be shooting right away from us, said Andrush, and Stashko suggested fattening him up like a Michaelmas goose. He needs a bit of flesh on those bones to keep him from looking like a scarecrow. The first down was beginning to appear on Vitko's chin and upper lip. Too, it was red, of course. Vitko did not notice, but Krabat did, watching Vitko, He could see how a boy could grow 3 years older in a single year of time. The first snow of the winter fell on St. Andrew's Day, quite late in the year. Once again, the journeymen at the mill in the fen grew restless, taciturn, and quarrelsome. They would pick a fight at the slightest provocation, and as the weeks went by, there were few days when at least one of them did not fly at someone else. Krabat remembered the conversation he had had with Tonda about this time last year. Were the men afraid to their very bones, because once again one of them was to die? How had he not come to think of that before? He had seen the waste ground and the row of low mounds, 7 or 8 of them, perhaps more. He had not counted them. Now he knew why the men were afraid. Now he shared their fear. Any one of them, with the possible exception of Vitko, might be the victim this year. But who would it be, and why? Krabat dared not ask any of his companions, not even Michael. He took out Tonda's knife more often than usual to snap it open and look at the blade. The blade was always shining, so he himself did not seem to be in danger, but it might be different tomorrow. There was a coffin ready in the woodshed. Krabat discovered it by accident when he went to fetch wood the day before Christmas Eve. It was covered with a piece of canvas, and Krabat would hardly have noticed it but for barking his shins on it in passing. Who had made that coffin? How long had it been standing there? And who was it for? That last question left Krabat no peace. It occupied his mind for the rest of the day, and even followed him into his dreams. Krabat has found a coffin in the woodshed, a pine coffin covered with a piece of canvas. Cautiously, he opens it and looks inside. It is empty. He decides to chop the coffin up. He cannot bear to think of it standing there, waiting for someone. Krabat sets to work with his hatchet. He pries the boards apart and splits them from top to bottom. Then he chops them into small, handy pieces, intending to put them in a basket and take them into Juro. But as he is looking around for a basket, crack! The coffin has put itself together again. It is intact, all in one piece. Krabat attacks it with his hatchet for a second time and chops it to matchwood. But no sooner has he done so than crack! The coffin is back again. In a fury now, the young man tries for the 3rd time. He chops and hacks until the splinters fly, until the coffin is nothing but a heap of tiny shavings. But it is no good. Crack! Crack! There is the coffin, put together again, without a scratch on it, waiting for its destined occupant. Horror seizes Krabat. He runs out into the fen. Snow is falling. Thick flurries of snow blinding him. He does not know where he is running to, and he fears the coffin may follow him. After a while, he stops to listen. No sound of wooden feet, no hollow rattling, as he feared. Instead, quite close, there is a grating, scraping sound, like someone digging in stony, frozen ground. Following the sound, Krabat comes to the waste ground, and through the driving snow, he makes out a figure digging a hole with spade and pick at the far end of the row of mounds, near the wood at the very spot where Krabat's one extra flower fell to the ground in the summer. Krabat thinks he recognizes the figure. He knows it is one of the miller's men, but he cannot be sure which in the flurries of snow. He opens his mouth to call, "Hey, who are you?" His voice fails him. He cannot utter a sound, and he finds it impossible to go a step further. He stays where he is. His feet are frozen to the ground. He cannot move them. The devil take it, he thinks. Have I gone lame? I must take those few steps. I must. He breaks out in a sweat as he summons up his last reserves of strength, but his feet will not obey him. Do what he will, he cannot move from the spot. And it snows, and it snows, and gradually the snow covers him up. Krabat woke, bathed in sweat. He threw back the blanket and tore the clammy shirt from his body. Then he went to the attic window and looked out. Christmas Day had dawned. It had snowed overnight, and he saw a fresh trail of footsteps leading into the fen. When he went out to wash at the pump, Michael came up the path with a pick and a spade. He was stooping as he walked, dragging his feet, and his face was pale. Krabat was about to speak to him, but Michael waved him away, and indeed, they understood each other without saying a word. Michael was a changed man after that. He kept aloof from Krabat and all the others, even Merton, as if there were a wall between him and them, as if he were already far away. So New Year's Eve came. The master did not put in an appearance. He had been gone since morning. Night fell, and the miller's men went to bed. Although he had made up his mind to stay awake, Krabat fell asleep like the others. He woke at midnight and began to listen. Somewhere in the house, there was a dull thud, then a scream, and then silence. Merton, the huge, bear-like, broad-shouldered Merton, began to sob like a child. Krabat pulled the blanket up over his ears, dug his fingers into the straw mattress, and wished he were dead. They found Michael on New Year's Day in the morning. He was lying on the floor of the meal store. A beam had fallen from the ceiling and broken his neck. They put him on a plank and carried him into the servants' hall, and there they said their farewells to him. Juro took off his clothes, washed him, and laid him in the pine coffin with a handful of straw under his neck. They took him out to the waste ground that afternoon and lowered him into the hole at the far end of the row of mounds near the wood. They buried him hastily and did not spend a moment longer than necessary at his gravesite. Only Merton remained behind.